All right, today we're going to work on 251 licks from this book. It's the Aebersol 251 Progression Edition. So I'll play the licks myself and then we'll talk about them. All right, so I hope you enjoyed those licks. There's a couple particular things I'd like to cover for the 13th and the 16th, but we'll go through the first two as well. So the first two, they're not on the board, but we'll just talk about them. The first two, which one was the third lick in the book. This is a 251 based on the key of D. So the first chord would be an E minor 7, the second chord would be A7, and the third chord would be a D major 7. So it was typical 251 sequence. But what we're doing here in the third lick example is we're trying to play off the chord. So it's a simple way of playing off the chord, not just playing the arpeggio, but basically you're just running through the scale series from the root of that chord. So the first measure of the lick starts on the E, starts on E because we're playing E minor 7, and it starts on E. It'll go up to the 5. And then the next one will be A. It'll start on A and then go up to the 5, and then start on D and go up to the 5. So if you listen to it, it kind of gives you a good example of kind of the harmony of a 251. And, you know, it gives you kind of an example of just a simplistic way of playing it, but one that shows the kind of the harmonic elements of it without many technical embellishments or doing anything fancy. The fifth example, which was lick 2, pretty much does the same thing. The only thing it's doing there is it's playing the scale from the root of that chord, so from E, A, and D, but it's going through the whole scale series. So it's playing from E all the way up back to E, from A all the way up to A, and then from D all the way up to D again, using the D major scale. All right, so technically what they're kind of doing is trying to look at the 251 as playing in different modes, using the modes of the scale, which would be the technical way of talking about it. But it's kind of irrelevant to what we're doing. It's all the same scale, essentially. You're using whether you're playing the D major scale over the E minor 7, you're still playing the D major scale. So let's go on to 13. 13 and 16 there's two particular features that I like to pay attention to, and would like for you to pay attention to, is this figure here and this figure here, which are the same. So let me grab my saxophone and give you an example of this real quick. So 13 and 16, they might sound a little bit different, but they have the same kind of things going on, particularly from the E7 to the A7. They're using a particular form that happens a lot in jazz. This is where I have the boxes here to outline this phrase that starts on the D. So doing that after you have an arpeggio. So this goes from the E7, the E minor 7 arpeggio. You're going to hear that pattern a lot in jazz, so it's a good thing to try to memorize that. Like I said, it doesn't just happen in the 3rd or the 13th, it happens in the 16th as well, in the middle of the 16th phrase as well. Another thing to pay attention to is the E flat, D sharp that happens before we play that E minor arpeggio. Before we do that, there's an E flat that comes in. Now going into an arpeggio with a flat or even a sharp note is very typical in jazz. So you could also take a sharp note. So if we're going to play a sharp, we would play an F before that E. So I'll play that E flat. Well, that's a very typical thing to do in jazz before you start a phrase. So in your own playing, you can start thinking, if I'm going to play an arpeggio, if I'm going to start and do a sequence like this, where I'm going to play an arpeggio on the first chord of the 2-5-1, I'm going to. Well, you can also put a sharp or flat in front of that before you start it, and that kind of chromatic note will give it a real kind of jazz feel to it. What else? Let's see. On the 16th, there's a nice chromatic movement at the beginning of it, which is again kind of typical of jazz. So it starts out. This is very typical of jazz. That's another thing that you might want to take account for, especially playing it in a low register like it's doing. So. It's a good way to start getting your line bouncing and moving. So. Yeah, so that's basically it. Learn the licks, learn them as best as you can. Play with them also. There's so many different ways. I'm covering, what's particularly the most, I guess, the most significant elements in these lines that's indicative of, playing in a jazzy kind of way. But as you begin to notice, not with just this kind of line or these kind of phrases, but with a lot of phrases, how you want to end them is kind of up to you. So I could take this first phrase and there's so many different things you can do with it. Or you can speed it up. It's endless, the amount of things that you can do with it. But what you particularly want to do is try to ingrain these elements like this element here, where you have a sharp going into an arpeggiation, and then going in to this movement here with a and then for down here, they're just going to it's the same kind of arpeggio. You're just going into it with a longer, you can look at it as just going into it with a longer chromatic phrase. So instead of just going, they're going So again, you see here we have it just going with with one sharp. Here with a whole chromatic phrase. But again, I'll play through both of those styles, and then you can see how that kind of sets the tempo for you playing a really jazzy kind of phrase. So. Now I'll use this one. So those are the ideas. Again, the sharp going into the arpeggio, and then the chromatics going into the arpeggio, and mixed in with this movement here, the where that comes from is it's kind of a voice leading thing. We can talk about that more in depth in another video. But what they're kind of doing is going into one arpeggio to the next. So. So it's kind of a pattern that you can keep going off that pattern. If you were to just ignore this and just play this, we can use this and keep going into another pattern. So I'm just using that basic form to play through your whole improvisation if you want it for a couple measures. All right, I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you soon.